It took an empty house on a Tuesday evening to make me understand that while I was building my career, my family had just kept going without me. My name is Daniel, and for the last 6 years, I was the kind of man who measured his worth in deadlines met and deals closed. I worked in project management for a construction firm, and I was good at it, really good. Promotions came, the salary grew, and I told myself that everything I was doing for them. For my wife Rachel, for my son Ethan, for my daughter Claire, and for my youngest, Noah. That was the story I kept telling myself, anyway. That Tuesday started like every other. I was in back-to-back meetings until 3, answered emails in the car on the way home, and pulled into the driveway already mentally drafting a report I needed to finish by morning. I remember thinking I'd grab something to eat, sit down at my desk, and keep working. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But when I opened the front door, the house was completely silent. Not the kind of quiet that settles after the kids go to bed, this was different. The lights were off in the kitchen. No backpacks by the stairs. No sound from upstairs, no television, nothing. I stood in the hallway for a second just listening, and then I walked from room to room like I was checking something, though I didn't even know what. I found a note on the kitchen counter from Rachel. She'd gone to the theater with her friends, something she'd apparently been planning for weeks. Ethan, our 14-year-old, was at a sports camp that had started on Sunday. Claire, who's 12, was staying late at school for rehearsals. She was in some kind of school play, the note said. And Noah, our youngest at 8, was at his friend Marcus's house for a sleepover. I read that note twice. Then I put it down and just stood there in the kitchen with the lights off. They all had somewhere to be. Every single one of them had a place to go, people waiting for them, things happening in their lives. And I hadn't known. I hadn't known about the theater, or the sports camp, or the school play. I didn't even know Noah had a close friend named Marcus. My 8-year-old son had a best friend whose name I was learning from a sticky note. I turned on the kitchen light and sat down at the table, and I just stayed there. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't check my phone. I sat in my own kitchen in complete silence and tried to remember the last real conversation I'd had with any of them. Not, how was school, in passing, not, good night, at the door, an actual conversation where I sat down and listened. And I couldn't remember. I genuinely could not point to a single moment in recent memory. Ethan was 14. When had that happened? I remembered him at 10, kicking a ball in the backyard, asking me to come outside. I remembered saying, in a little while, and then never going. Claire was performing in a school play and I hadn't even known she was interested in theater. The last thing I could clearly remember about her was that she'd wanted to redecorate her room, and I'd told Rachel to handle it because I had a project deadline. And Noah, who still sometimes climbed into our bed on weekend mornings, had a whole friendship I knew nothing about. I sat at that table for a long time. The house stayed quiet. And somewhere in that silence, a thought came in slowly and settled like something heavy. They hadn't stopped living their lives waiting for me to show up. They had just continued. Rachel had her friends, her evenings out, her plans. The kids had their camps and their rehearsals and their sleepovers. And I had my deadlines. I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for someone to blame. I just felt something I hadn't felt in years, something close to being lost. Except I was sitting in my own home, at my own kitchen table, and that somehow made it worse. By the time Rachel got home that night, I hadn't moved. She came in laughing at something, still finishing a story she'd been telling on the phone, and then she saw me sitting there in the half-lit kitchen and stopped. "Daniel," she said. "What's wrong?" And I looked at her, really looked at her, and I said, "I don't know anything about our kids' lives, Rachel. I don't know what's happening with any of them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set her bag down slowly, and she said, "I know." Those 2 words hit differently than I expected. Not, "What do you mean?" or "That's not true." Just, "I know." Which meant she'd seen it too, probably for a long time, and had been carrying that quietly while I was buried in spreadsheets and site reports. She sat down across from me at the table, and we talked. Really talked, the way we hadn't in I couldn't tell you how long. I asked her when it had started, the distance, the drifting, and she didn't give me a dramatic answer. She just said it had been gradual. That at some point she'd stopped mentioning things to me because I always seemed to be in the middle of something, and eventually she just stopped expecting me to be present for the small stuff. The theater tonight, she said, she hadn't even thought to tell me about because she assumed I'd be working late anyway. And she wasn't wrong. That was the part that stayed with me. She hadn't been keeping things from me out of resentment. She'd simply adjusted her life around my absence the way you reroute around a road that's always closed. It had just become normal. I asked her what the kids were like now, actually like, day to day, and she talked for almost an hour. She told me that Ethan had gotten serious about wrestling, that he'd been training for months and had his first regional competition coming up in 3 weeks. She told me Claire had discovered she loved being on stage, that her drama teacher had told Rachel she was a natural, and that her school performance was in 2 weeks. And Noah was obsessed with go-karts. Had been for almost a year. Every time they drove past the karting place on Route 9, he pressed his face against the window. I hadn't known any of it. Not one detail. We didn't fight that night. There was nothing to fight about, really. This wasn't about blame. It was about the fact that I had checked out without ever meaning to, and somewhere along the way my family had quietly learned to live without counting on me. Rachel didn't say that to be cruel. She said it because it was true, and because I was finally sitting still long enough to hear it. The next morning I got up before everyone and I made breakfast. Real breakfast, eggs, toast, the whole thing. Noah came downstairs first and looked at me like I was a surprise guest in my own kitchen. He climbed up onto the stool and said, "Dad, why are you home?" And I said, "Because I live here." He laughed like it was a joke. I didn't correct him. Over the next few days I talked to each of the kids separately. With Ethan I sat on the edge of his bed one evening and asked him about wrestling, genuinely asked, not the half-listening version I'd been doing. He was skeptical at first, giving me short answers, but then something loosened and he started explaining the technique, the weight categories, what he was working on. He talked for 40 minutes. I didn't look at my phone once. With Claire it was harder. She was polite, the way kids are when they've learned not to need you too much. I asked her about the play and she told me the basics, and then I asked if I could see her practice her lines, and something in her face shifted. She went and got the script and we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She was good, genuinely, surprisingly good, and I told her so, and she looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether to believe me. Then she smiled, a real one, and said, "Come see the actual show then." I told her I wouldn't miss it. Rachel and I went out to dinner the following Friday, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in close to 2 years. We went to a small Italian place she'd mentioned wanting to try, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with logistics or schedules. We talked about us. About what we'd been like before the promotions and the projects and the years of me promising to slow down after the next big deadline. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one, and by the end of the night something between us felt lighter. 3 weeks after that Tuesday evening in the empty kitchen, Ethan had his regional wrestling competition. I drove 4 hours to be there. He didn't win, came in third in his weight class, but when he walked off the mat and saw me standing at the edge of the bleachers, his face did something I hadn't seen in years. He jogged over and I grabbed him and said, "Third out of 16. That's something." And he said, "You actually came." Not excited, not sarcastic, just quiet, like a fact he was still registering. "I actually came," I said. Claire's school play was on a Thursday evening. I sat in the third row. She played the lead, and she was remarkable, confident, natural, completely at home on that stage. Afterward she found me in the hallway and hugged me, which she hadn't done in longer than I could remember. "Did you like it?" she asked. I told her she was the best one up there. She rolled her eyes, but she was grinning. The weekend after that, I took Noah to the karting place on Route 9. Just the two of us. He talked the entire drive there, explaining everything he knew about go-karts with the absolute authority of an 8-year-old who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. We raced 3 heats. He beat me twice, and he was not humble about it. On the drive home he fell asleep in the back seat still wearing his racing bracelet from the track, and I looked at him in the rearview mirror and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I went into work that Monday and I restructured my schedule. Not gradually, not, I'll try to be home by 7, I actually restructured it. I handed off 2 accounts, I stopped taking calls after 6, and I booked 3 weeks of vacation for the following month. Rachel was standing at the counter when I told her. She looked up and said, "You're serious?" I told her yes. She was quiet for a second, then she said, "Okay. Where are we going?" I said, "Mountains. Wherever you want." She looked at me for a moment, and then she smiled, the real one, the one I remembered from before all of this, and she said, "I'll start looking tonight." We left on a Saturday morning, all 5 of us, with too much luggage and a cooler full of food and Noah asking every 11 minutes how much longer until we got there. We drove up into the mountains and for 3 weeks there were no deadlines, no reports, no calls I had to take. There was hiking and card games and bad weather that kept us inside laughing at nothing. There was a night around a fire when all 3 kids were talking over each other and Rachel caught my eye across the flames and just nodded once, like, this. This is what it's supposed to be. On the last night, after the kids had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat outside on the cabin porch and just listened to the quiet. After a while she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Don't lose us again." I put my arm around her and said, "I won't." And this time, I meant it.